U.S. Democrat Party representative from Massachusetts, Jim McGovern, expressed concerns regarding Trump having access to nuclear codes. Now, Jim McGovern has asked the cabinet to take away nuclear codes from what he calls a madman. Let's listen in.
The President of the United States is a madman. In case you haven't heard, he's threatening to commit genocidal war crimes, threatening to wipe out an entire civilization, killing innocent men, women, and children. That is illegal under federal and international law. Our brave men and women in the military took an oath to the Constitution, not to a president. And under law, they are required to disobey unlawful orders. Now, if Trump's cabinet had an ounce of integrity, they'd invoke the 25th Amendment and they would take the nuclear codes away from this deranged lunatic before more innocent people are killed. But they're a bunch of fawning sycophants, and so I doubt they're going to do that. Speaker Johnson, you need to call Congress back into session right now. We need to rein in this psychopath. We need to debate and we need to vote to end this war now.
What's happening, friends? Jack here with another big episode. The man who built his empire on volume and spectacle went suddenly silent, disappearing from the scene of his administration's disaster without a press conference, a social media post, or a single word to the cameras. The silence echoed through Washington, through Senate hearings, and through the White House, leaving staff scrambling and critics wondering where the voice that once dominated every room had gone. And while he was gone, the people he left behind were left to face the music alone. The cabinet members he had personally selected, the senior officials he had installed specifically because they would defend him no matter what, the loyalists who had traded their independent judgment for proximity to power, all of them were being dragged through the most brutal Senate hearings of their careers. Senators from both parties were hammering them with questions they could not adequately answer.
All right, and these are the words coming in from U.S. Democrat Party representative from Massachusetts, Jim McGovern, who's expressing concerns regarding Trump having access to nuclear codes. Jim McGovern has asked the cabinet to take away nuclear codes from what he calls a madman. And remember, all this also coming in at a time when as many as 70 congressmen and women are being gathered to go ahead and invoke the 25th Amendment, and specifically Section 4 of the 25th Amendment, to impeach a sitting president of the United States, in this case, none other than Donald Trump.
To end this war, the President of the United States is a madman. In case you haven't heard, he's threatening to commit genocidal war crimes, threatening to wipe out an entire civilization, killing innocent men, women, and children. That is illegal under federal and international law. Our brave men and women in the military took an oath to the Constitution, not to a president. And under law, they are required to disobey unlawful orders. Now, if Trump's cabinet had an ounce of integrity, they'd invoke the 25th Amendment and they would take the nuclear codes away from this deranged lunatic before more innocent people are killed. But they're a bunch of fawning sycophants, and so I doubt they're going to do that. Speaker Johnson, you need to call Congress back into session right now. We need to rein in this psychopath. We need to debate and we need to vote to end this war now.
Publicly accusing them of enabling someone who was not fit to serve, and doing it all with the cameras rolling and the C-SPAN archives recording every evasive answer and every deflected question for posterity. Privately, those same officials were seething. They were furious at being put in an impossible position by a president who had decided the moment things got uncomfortable that he had somewhere else to be. They had signed up to serve a fighter, someone who would stand with them in the trenches, and instead they found themselves alone in the line of fire while he flew off to avoid the heat. The frustration was not confined to the hearing rooms. On Capitol Hill, members of Congress were reaching for language that had previously been reserved for the most extreme scenarios. Representative Jim McGovern went public with a statement that cut through the usual diplomatic language of political discourse. He declared that if Trump's cabinet had one shred of integrity left,
President Trump standing behind his $1.776 billion anti-weaponization fund, even as Republican senators increasingly condemn the idea. And the controversy threatens to divide his party even further. Trump writing today on social media, quote, "I gave up a lot of money in allowing the fund," saying he could have settled his lawsuit against the IRS for $10 billion over his leaked tax returns for much more. The New York Times reported this week, we should note, that IRS lawyers had prepared several ways for the Justice Department to fight Trump's $10 billion lawsuit. They wrote this down in a 25-page memo passed on to the Treasury Department, although it's unclear if that memo ever reached the Justice Department. Ultimately, the Justice Department, which reports to Donald Trump, of course, never fought the lawsuit, leading to this highly unusual situation. Both Treasury and IRS did not respond to the New York Times request for comment, and the Justice Department did not tell the Times why it chose to settle this case the way it did. Sources tell CNN that the White House has no plans to change the structure of the fund, even after a fraught meeting on Capitol Hill yesterday between the acting Attorney General Todd Blanche.
They would immediately invoke the 25th Amendment and take the nuclear codes away from the madmen in the White House. He was not speaking metaphorically. He was not employing rhetorical excess for dramatic effect. He was making a specific constitutional argument that the president's conduct had reached a level of danger that required the most extreme institutional response available. And he was not alone in that assessment. Representative Melanie Stansbury had been making a similar case weeks earlier, calling Trump not fit to serve as president and commander-in-chief, and urging every constitutional tool available, including both the 25th Amendment and impeachment, to address what she described as an ongoing emergency. The dynamic that had produced this moment was genuinely extraordinary. A president who had spent his entire political career refusing to back down from any fight.
And several upset Senate Republicans. The White House says the administration appreciated the feedback and looks forward to additional conversations as needed. Well, it looks like they will be needed. Senate Republicans abruptly left town last night without acting on key legislation, specifically Trump's immigration package. The White House is now feeling the full force of a furious majority. Former Republican leader Mitch McConnell rebuked the pitch, saying, quote, "So the nation's top law enforcement official is asking for a slush fund to pay people who assault cops? Utterly stupid, morally wrong. Take your pick," unquote. How about both? Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson is one of the few senators who has publicly supported the fund, but he does see its introduction on the same week as his key vote on Trump's immigration bill, angering his party at the wrong time, saying, quote, "Somebody described it as a galactic blunder, and I think that's probably true," unquote. Joining us now to discuss, CNN's Lauren Fox and Paula,
who had turned confrontation into an art form and aggression into a governing philosophy, had simply walked away from one of the most consequential institutional crises of his presidency. The Senate situation was chaotic in ways that deserve to be understood clearly. A shutdown fight was threatening to leave critical agencies like the TSA, FEMA, and the Coast Guard without funding. A bipartisan compromise was being negotiated to address the funding gap, the kind of deal where members from both parties agree on something because the alternative is real, visible damage to agencies that ordinary Americans depend on for their safety and security. At the same time, Trump had been escalating his rhetoric against Iran to a level that was alarming even his most loyal supporters. He was making maximalist threats, talking about unconditional surrender, warning that he would destroy civilian infrastructure, including power plants and water systems, and issuing 48-hour ultimatums that international law experts had already flagged as potentially constituting war crimes under both domestic and international law. The combination was explosive. A foreign policy crisis with war crimes implications unfolding simultaneously with a domestic budget crisis that threatened to ground flights and halt disaster response. And Trump left Washington before either crisis reached its resolution. He left without weighing in on the compromise in any helpful way. He left without offering guidance to his cabinet about how to handle the Senate hearings. He left without giving his allies in Congress the political cover they desperately needed. He left his cabinet and his Senate allies holding a bag that he had packed and then abandoned. McGovern's post captured the frustration directly. Trump left without a vote on the Senate compromise to pay the TSA, FEMA, and the Coast Guard. And the response from members of Congress who were watching the institutional consequences of that abandonment was exactly what you would expect when a president creates a crisis and then disappears. Anger directed at him loudly, specifically, publicly. The 25th Amendment call from McGovern was the most extreme expression of that anger, but it was not an isolated statement. Stansbury had been making a similar case, and she made a point that cut directly at the Republican side of the aisle. She said the ball was in the court of the Republicans in the cabinet and in the Congress, and that her Democratic colleagues had not seen Republican colleagues willing to take a public stance to hold the president accountable. That framing, that the accountability failure is primarily a Republican failure, that the people with the actual constitutional power to act are choosing not to use it, is the question sitting at the center of this entire moment. And Trump going quiet instead of answering for the Senate disaster made it harder, not easier, for his allies to defend the inaction. They were left to explain why a president who had threatened war crimes and abandoned a shutdown compromise deserved their continued support, and they had to do it without any guidance from the president himself. The cabinet was facing a specific form of political and institutional stress that was becoming increasingly visible. Senate hearings have been one of the primary venues where accountability pressure has been most visible, and the Boston Globe documented the strategy that Trump's cabinet has adopted in response. Fight back and get personal. Instead of the traditional cabinet approach of offering careful, respectful answers to Senate questions and defending the administration's record on the merits, officials like Pam Bondi and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. responded to oversight hearings by attacking the senators, asking the questions personally. They did it on camera in ways specifically designed to generate clips for right-wing media rather than to actually answer the questions being posed. Trump publicly praised Bondi's performance, saying she was incredible and that she had exposed the senators. But the Democratic senator who was on the receiving end of that approach described it accurately as designed to divert attention. Because that is exactly what it is when you cannot defend the record on the merits. When the record includes a stalled Iran war, a shutdown fight that left key agencies unfunded, international law warnings about civilian infrastructure threats, and an approval rating in the mid-30s, the alternative strategy is to make the hearing about the senators rather than about the policies. It generates clips, it satisfies the base, and it does absolutely nothing to address the underlying governing problems that produced the hearing in the first place. The 25th Amendment calls are the most dramatic element of this story, and they deserve serious treatment rather than being dismissed as political theater. The constitutional mechanism is real, and the bar for invoking it is specific and genuinely high. Section 4 of the 25th Amendment, the provision McGovern and Stansbury are invoking, allows the Vice President and a majority of the Cabinet to declare in writing that the President is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. If they do that, the Vice President immediately assumes the role of acting President. The President can then object, can send his own written declaration to Congress saying he is able to discharge his duties. And if he does, the Cabinet has 4 days to reaffirm their original declaration. If they reaffirm, Congress has 21 days to vote on the question, and removal requires a 2/3 majority in both chambers. That is the process. And the bar it sets is not simply that the President is making decisions that legislators disagree with, or that his policies are causing harm. The standard is inability to discharge the duties of the office, a standard that was written with genuine physical or mental incapacity in mind, not political disagreement with executive decisions. Which means that even setting aside the political question of whether any Trump cabinet member would actually participate in the 25th Amendment invocation, the constitutional standard for doing so is significantly higher than being wrong about Iran's strategy or irresponsible about government funding. McGovern and Stansbury are using the 25th Amendment frame as the sharpest possible statement about how seriously they view the current situation, not as a literal prediction that it is about to happen. Understanding that distinction is important for being honest about what this moment actually represents. It represents Democrats reaching for the most extreme constitutional language available to communicate their assessment of the danger of the current moment. It represents frustration that has no other available outlet because the Republican majority is not moving on impeachment, the Senate is not moving on war powers, and the Cabinet is responding to oversight hearings by attacking the questioners. The 25th Amendment call is the constitutional equivalent of screaming into a void that is not responding. It is real in its language. It is significant in what it reveals about the political temperature. And it is not going to happen because the cabinet that would have to invoke it is the same cabinet that has spent months defending Trump at hearings by going after senators personally. The question of whether Trump's loyalists would ever exercise independent constitutional judgment is the heart of what makes the 25th Amendment question so revealing. The New Yorker documented what it described as Trump's cabinet of revenge, a description of how officials like Tulsi Gabbard and Kash Patel behaved under Senate questioning in ways that were specifically oriented toward demonstrating loyalty to Trump rather than toward engaging substantively with the institutional role of the cabinet. These are not officials who were appointed because of their expertise or their institutional knowledge or their capacity for independent judgment in a crisis. They were appointed primarily because of their loyalty. And loyalty-appointed officials do not invoke Section 4 of the 25th Amendment against the person whose loyalty secured them the appointment. The structural reality of this cabinet is that the constitutional check the 25th Amendment is supposed to provide, the cabinet as an independent institutional actor capable of recognizing and responding to presidential incapacity, has been substantially hollowed out by the appointment process itself. A cabinet of loyalists is not built for independent constitutional judgment. It is built for personal defense and political performance. And the fight back and get personal strategy at Senate hearings is the most visible expression of what that looks like in practice. The senators get attacked, the clips get made, Trump gets praised, and the underlying governance questions that produce the hearing go unaddressed. That is the cabinet that McGovern and Stansbury are asking to invoke the 25th Amendment. And the gap between the ask and the realistic probability of it happening is itself a statement about the state of the constitutional accountability infrastructure right now. Senator Tim Kaine's specific framing adds another dimension to this story. His call to bring the Senate back into session was legally and constitutionally distinct from the 25th Amendment talk and deserves to be understood on its own terms. Kaine was not calling for Trump's removal. He was calling for the Senate to exercise its own constitutional authority, specifically its war powers authority, to respond to what he described as Trump's unhinged threats to commit massive war crimes against Iranian civilian infrastructure. The specific nature of that threat is important. Trump had publicly said on live television, in ways that were covered by every major outlet, that he would destroy civilian power plants and water systems in Iran if Iran did not comply with his demands. International law experts had already flagged those statements as potentially constituting war crimes under both domestic and international law. Kaine's position was that the Senate had a responsibility to respond to those statements, not as political commentary, but as a constitutional matter, that a president threatening to break international law on live television is precisely the kind of situation that requires the legislative branch to assert its authority rather than defer. The Senate has war powers authority. It has the ability to pass legislation limiting the president's ability to conduct military operations without authorization. Republicans had already broken with Trump on war powers votes in ways that made clear the caucus unity on this issue was not solid. And Kaine was pushing on exactly that crack, arguing that the moment required the Senate to come back into session and act, not to wait for the next scheduled legislative day to address what he characterized as an immediate constitutional emergency. The dynamic that explains why the fight back and get personal cabinet strategy is not actually managing the situation effectively is crucial to understand. Senate hearings are not primarily about what happens in the hearing room. They are about what the hearing produces, the testimony, the refusals, the evasions, the personal attacks, that then enters the broader political record. When a cabinet member attacks a senator personally, instead of answering a question about why the government almost shut down or why the president threatened to destroy civilian water infrastructure, the attack generates a clip. But the clip sits alongside the original question, which remains unanswered. And unanswered questions from Senate hearings do not go away. They go into the record, they get cited in floor speeches, They get referenced in the next hearing. They become part of the accumulated evidence of an administration that is not willing to engage with legitimate accountability questions. The fight back and get personal strategy generates short-term media attention that satisfies the base. It also generates long-term accountability documentation that the opposition, the press, and future investigators are going to use for years. Trump praised Bondi for it. The senators asking the questions watched the attacks and went home and filed the unanswered questions away for next time. Both things are true simultaneously. And the imbalance between the short-term political benefit and the long-term institutional cost is exactly what you would expect from an administration making decisions under immediate pressure rather than with strategic patience. What Trump going quiet actually communicates is politically more significant than it might appear on the surface. Trump's default mode when under pressure is to fight, to get louder, to dominate the conversation by flooding it with so much noise that the specific criticism gets buried under the volume. His entire political strategy across 2 terms has been built on that instinct. So when he departs from that instinct, when he leaves Washington and avoids the cameras and lets others absorb the heat without weighing in himself, it signals something about the specific nature of the pressure he is under. It suggests that the normal strategy of louder and more is not available or not viable for this particular set of facts. The Senate disaster, the war crimes warnings, the shutdown fight over TSA and FEMA funding, the bipartisan frustration with his Iran management. These are not controversies that respond well to his usual amplification strategy. They are situations where more noise generates more coverage of the underlying problems rather than drowning them out. Going quiet is in a perverse way the strategically rational choice in that environment, but it leaves his cabinet exposed. It leaves his allies in the Senate without the kind of political cover that an active, aggressive presidential response would provide. And it communicates to everyone watching in the Senate, in the cabinet, in the broader Republican political world that the president has decided this particular fight is not one he wants to be visible in. That calculation, once perceived, changes how the people around him make their own calculations about where their loyalty is actually serving them. Because loyalty in a political operation is always conditional on some level. It is maintained as long as the cost of loyalty is lower than the cost of defection. When a president goes quiet at the moment of maximum pressure and leaves his cabinet and his Senate allies holding the bag, when the signal from the top is that this particular fight is not worth his visible engagement, the people absorbing the heat start asking themselves whether the loyalty bargain they entered into is actually working in their favor. The cabinet members who are being personally attacked at hearings and then praised by a president who is not in the room to absorb any of the consequences, they are starting to ask that question too. And when enough of them reach the same answer at the same time, the loyalty system does not gradually loosen, it breaks. The fight back and get personal strategy at Senate hearings says something profound about the administration's relationship with institutional accountability. Traditional cabinet officials, even in politically contentious administrations, recognize that Senate oversight hearings serve a constitutional function. They are how the legislative branch monitors executive branch conduct. Engaging with them substantively, defending the policies, explaining the decisions, providing the information that oversight requires, is the expected behavior of a cabinet member who respects the institutional role they occupy. What Trump's cabinet has adopted instead is a strategy that treats the hearings as a political performance opportunity rather than an oversight obligation. Attack the questioner. Generate the clip. Get praised by the president. Hope the underlying questions never actually get answered in a forum where the answers matter. That strategy has a specific cost, not just to the institution, but to the officials themselves. When you spend a Senate hearing attacking senators instead of defending policies, you are making yourself the story rather than the policy. When the policy eventually produces bad enough outcomes that the story cannot be managed any other way, the personal attacks you made during the hearing become part of your documented record of avoiding accountability. The senators remember. The press remembers. The clips that were supposed to be playing on right-wing media are also sitting in the C-SPAN archive as evidence of what happened when you were asked to explain yourself and you chose personal attack instead. The 25th Amendment calls reveal the state of the constitutional accountability conversation in this country right now. Impeachment is stalled in the House. War powers resolutions in the Senate are mostly symbolic. Court cases on immunity are working their way through the system. And now sitting members of Congress are calling on the cabinet to invoke the most extreme constitutional removal mechanism that exists outside of impeachment, doing so not as a fringe position, but as a public on-the-record statement about the state of the presidency. None of those accountability mechanisms are currently producing the outcomes they are designed to produce. Impeachment is stalled. War powers resolutions are symbolic. The courts are still processing the immunity questions. And the cabinet, which is the only institution that could invoke the 25th Amendment, is built for loyalty rather than for independent constitutional judgment. The result is a situation where there is no shortage of constitutional vocabulary being deployed. Madman, war crimes, unhinged, not fit to serve, but also no mechanism that is currently functioning well enough to translate that vocabulary into consequence. Trump going quiet rather than engaging is, in a specific and uncomfortable way, a rational response to that gap. He does not need to defend himself loudly when none of the mechanisms demanding accountability are currently capable of delivering it. The quiet is not weakness. It is a calculation about where the real danger is and where it is not. Right now, the real danger to his presidency is not the 25th Amendment calls or the Senate hearings. It is the midterm map. It is the approval rating that keeps sitting in the mid-30s. It is the congressional coalition that keeps losing votes. Those are the threats that quiet cannot address. And those are the threats that are going to demand answers that cannot be provided by avoiding the cameras. The specific question of what happens when a constitutional accountability system reaches a moment where the vocabulary of accountability exists, but the mechanisms for enforcing it are all simultaneously stuck, is the defining institutional tension of this moment. The 25th Amendment exists. The impeachment process exists. The war powers authority of Congress exists. The judicial review of presidential conduct exists. All of these are real constitutional tools, and none of them are currently producing consequences that match the scale of what is being described in the public record. A president making war crimes threats on live television, abandoning Washington during a shutdown fight, having his cabinet attack senators instead of answering questions, generating 25th Amendment calls from sitting members of Congress. The gap between what the constitutional vocabulary is saying and what the constitutional mechanisms are delivering is the defining institutional tension of this moment. Resolving it, restoring the functional connection between the severity of conduct and the scale of consequence, is the challenge that November is ultimately going to force one way or another. Either the voters deliver consequences that the institutions have been unable to deliver, or the institutions find their capacity to act and the voters' verdict becomes secondary. Both of those futures are possible. Which one materializes is going to depend on what happens in the months between now and the midterm results. Trump went quiet. The noise around him got louder, and the mechanisms designed to translate that noise into accountability are still finding their footing. The quiet that Trump chose when he left Washington was not peace. It was pressure building behind a door that is being held shut by thinner and thinner margins in the Senate, in the House, in the cabinet, in the courts, in the approval ratings, in the midterm map. Every day that passes without a release valve producing consequence is another day the pressure builds. The 25th Amendment is not the release valve. Impeachment as currently constituted is not the release valve. But something is. And the people who are watching the pressure build, the senators who are breaking on war powers, the cabinet members who are privately seething while publicly performing loyalty, the Republican strategists who are using the word disaster to describe what they see coming in November, all of them can feel it, even if they cannot yet agree on what it is or when it arrives.